Hey, Ashley.
And customized to suit your projects. So before we get into that, I want to share a little bit about me. I did not grow up in the libraries world. My background is actually in learning and organization development, and my master's degree is in human resource development. I spent 9 years working with the College of Continuing and Professional Studies at the University of Minnesota, running continuing ed programs for professionals and organizations looking to upskill. And part of my job actually was supporting the project management certificate program that both Carla and I went through and that she mentioned. And I really can't recommend that program enough. That's where I learned a lot of really great practical tools and concepts to run projects effectively. Then in 2018, I joined the University of Minnesota Libraries in my organization development role. And over my career, I've worked on and led program development and curriculum development projects, process improvement projects and Kaizens, and strategic change projects. And right now, the big project that I am managing is a strategic planning effort for the University of Minnesota Libraries. And I give this background to acknowledge that the kinds of projects that I've worked on and led may be a little bit different than the projects that you are currently working on, but the concepts and tools to run effective projects are really the same. Also, in case anyone is interested, this picture was taken at Grand Prismatic in Yellowstone, one of the coolest places I've been. All right, so let's jump into project planning. And here's just an overview reminder of the life cycle of a project. It shows the different phases of the project: initiate, plan, execute, monitor, and control, and close. And project planning is the second phase, what we'll be covering today in that life cycle. So by this point, when you're ready to start the planning phase of the project, you have defined what the project is in the initiation phase. You've written your charter, you understand your scope, you know who is going to be involved in the project, either as a team or as stakeholders. And if you missed the last one that Francine led, the last webinar all about scope and charters, I highly recommend going back and watching that one. It helps you kind of set up and shows how the project sort of flows from one phase to the other. So what we're going to be talking about today is the project planning phase. It's all about defining how you'll accomplish the goal successfully. In essence, it is the preparation phase for the project. And I really like this definition of what project planning is. So project planning is the process of deciding in advance what, when, how, and who will take the necessary actions to accomplish established objectives. Essentially, this phase is all about documenting a roadmap for your project. So why plan? This kind of feels like an obvious question, but I actually want to hear from you. So in the chat, why do you think project planning for your project is important? What are your thoughts and ideas? And we can kind of talk a little bit about that. So I'll give you a couple seconds, just anything that comes to mind. Why should you plan your project? Find gaps. Keep the whole team focused on goals. Oh yeah, they're coming in now. Defines expectations, absolutely. So that there's a clear timeline. Find out what we need and what we have. Yep, finding those resource gaps. Absolutely. Oh, a lot of great stuff in here. Troubleshoot barriers. Save time, yes. And we'll talk a little bit about the timing aspect of the project planning phase, because often it's something that you want to rush through. And I really recommend that you spend time on planning. Finding funding, starting point is good to be able to adapt from. Keep yourself organized. Yes, these are all really great responses. Communicate expectations. So I really like the quote here from Yogi Berra: if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. So essentially, project planning allows you to figure out where you're going and how you're going to get there. It helps you bridge the gap between having the idea and making it a reality by putting structure in place. And that structure is so valuable for giving everyone that clear direction, We know projects are often collaborative endeavors, and you need everyone to be on the same page with who's doing what, how are we communicating, what are the expectations, what are the requirements of the project. And project planning also helps project managers get buy-in and bring people along with the project. It can help mobilize people to work towards the same goal, the same outcome. So yeah, I think project planning is so important to the success of a project. It might not be the kind of one deciding factor. There might be projects that have not been planned that succeed and projects that have been planned and failed. But I think it's one of the key things that you can start doing if you're not already doing it to increase the likelihood of success of your projects. So next, let's talk about the elements of the project plan. And the first is that scope statement. So that's something that you probably created when you were in the initiation phase, when you wrote out your charter. And it's important to include what's in scope and what's out of scope. So again, Francine a couple weeks ago talked all about scope creep and how to avoid it. And one of the ways is by identifying what's out of scope so that it's really clear to stakeholders, to team members, and it can kind of be a guardrail for you if you're getting into the project and starting to experience that scope creep. The next element are the deliverables. And deliverable is basically the product, element, or result of the project. It's what the team and ultimately the project manager are responsible for delivering at the end of the project. Or you can think of deliverables as the outputs of the project. So some examples of deliverables on different kinds of projects might be a new automated workflow, it might be a space redesign, or it could be a report. I'm actually working on a project right now where the output is a recommendations report to a larger committee. The next element is a schedule with milestones. And that schedule basically dictates, when the project is going to start, when it's going to end, what are some of the key points in between. And those milestones are kind of like gates you can think of to get to the next phase or a door into the next room. Milestones can also be completing specific deliverables. So these might be times when you go back to your stakeholders and give them updates or get approval before moving forward. So an example, I mentioned that I'm managing a strategic planning effort for the University of Minnesota Libraries. And one of our early phases in the project was gathering stakeholder feedback. So one of our milestones that we actually just hit was completing the summary report and reporting that out on the data that we gathered during that phase. The next element is the work breakdown structure, and we're going to get into this a little bit more deeply shortly here. But this is where you document all of the phases of the project, the tasks and activities that need to take place to complete the project, and it's where you can plot out the timeline in a little bit more detail. Then there's the stakeholder management plan. So you probably identified your stakeholders during that initiation phase as you were working on your charter. But in the planning phase, you need to determine who you need to engage throughout the project and how you're going to engage with them. The next element is the risk management plan. And I have to admit, this is the one that I often skip over when I'm doing projects, and it is always to my detriment because inevitably something comes up that I didn't expect or hadn't thought through. The risk management plan allows you to think through potential issues or events that could impact the success of the project. Next is the communication and change management plan. So most projects require some sort of change in process or behavior when implemented. It could be, upgrading a tool and having people working on a new workflow, might be a new process that requires people to change the way they do things or interact with people. So this plan helps you identify when you'll need to communicate what and how you're going to bring people up to speed, whether it's through training or piloting a new process with a team. And then finally, the documentation plan. And this is basically just where you'll spell out how and when or how and where you are going to store project documents. So who will have access to what, where will things be stored, what format will documents be stored in. it's kind of a way to level set and make sure that there's transparency in your projects for team members and key stakeholders. So as much as I'd love to go over everything today, we're going to be focusing on just 3 of the elements: the work breakdown structure, stakeholder management plan, and risk management plan. And Carla mentioned that she'll be sending out the slides from today, and along with that, I included a template that you can use. It's something that I used in my continuing and professional education days and still use today, kind of an adapted tool that you can start applying right away. All right, so let's talk about the work breakdown structure, or WBS, because everything has to be an acronym. The work breakdown structure is a hierarchical planning document that allows the planner to identify and sequence the project activities. So the work breakdown structure identifies the phases of the project, the deliverables of the project, the key milestones, and then the tasks that are associated with each phase or milestone or deliverable. And I'll be honest, this is one of my favorite parts of the project plan. I feel like it's an area where you can kind of be creative and start seeing things take shape. You can start seeing how you can take something that's just an idea and start putting it into action. It is also kind of a laborious activity, I will warn you. So there are a couple ways that you can have your work breakdown structure. Sometimes it's just kind of at a high level, and then you dig in with another tool, and we'll talk about a couple ways to do that. One of my favorites, and what you'll be getting from Carla along with the slides, is a Gantt chart. And this provides a way to visualize the tasks that need to be done over a certain time. So you can see where there's overlap in activities or float time. And float time just refers to essentially how long you can delay a task or activity without it impacting the deadline. So on this Gantt chart, you'll see kind of some of the main buckets are the tasks, and often there's kind of a number that you can associate with them. There's the timeline, and this is where you track and can visualize the tasks and how long they're going to take. And then you can include the assignments. So basically, who's going to be responsible for each task associated with each phase or deliverable. This one has a couple more sort of more complex options. So you can outline what are your goals or maybe key milestones that you want to track side by side with your tasks. But the great thing about this is you can kind of customize it to fit whatever the project needs. And along with this version, if you just Google Gantt chart, there are a lot of really great Excel spreadsheets and templates out there that you can use and apply. But really the main elements are those tasks, the timeline, and the assignments. And this is a really great layout, I think, for something that falls into more of a waterfall methodology. So if you remember Carla talking in the first webinar of this series about the different methodologies, you have the waterfall, agile, and the spiral methodology. Waterfall is when there's a lot of dependencies on the tasks, and this is a great way to kind of document where those dependencies exist and kind of see the overlap, see how things build on each other. So this is an image of a Gantt chart in practice, and this is from a performance management update that I'm currently working on. And I wanted to show you this to acknowledge that sometimes you put together a great plan and it doesn't end up looking the way you thought. So unfortunately, I don't have a before picture for this, but when I initially put together the plan and timeline, everything flowed really nicely together. It was kind of stacked like a really nice visual. And over time, with many unforeseen impacts, some activities were cut out or rolled into a broader task, and the timeline shifted. So I just wanted to share this to say that it's okay if your project plan isn't executed the way that you expected, because in general, it won't be. But you'll be in a much better position to respond to changes if you've outlined what and how the project should be carried out. So just wanted to include that. And this is another kind of way that you can set up your Gantt chart. This one is a little bit different, but based on the previous slide that I showed, this one includes status and notes rather than the assignments and goals that were in the previous example. So the next tool that you can use to track work is a Kanban board. And Kanban means signboard in Japanese. Kanban is a system that came out of the Toyota lean manufacturing with the goal of continuous delivery. So the ultimate goal here is to limit the work in progress by continually moving things forward, or basically from left to right. So as you can see on this example, you have your to-dos, your in progress, your on hold, and your done. Now, a very kind of standard basic Kanban board will just have a to-do column, in progress, and done. This example on the Trello board is a little bit more in depth. It has what's up next, it has on hold, it has questions. And I love using Trello for the Kanban approach because it's really customizable, it's really dynamic and easy to update. It's also very visually appealing, which is nice. And you can track changes on each card. So it's a great way to kind of manage changes that are happening in real time. Also, Trello is very collaborative. So you can add your team members, you can add key stakeholders that you want to have visibility into the work of the project, and they can kind of track progress along with status updates that, that you might be wanting to communicate. And I think this option, the Kanban approach, is really good for agile projects or spiral projects. So these are a little bit more iterative. They might have distinct deliverables and tasks that aren't necessarily interdependent. And it's a really great way to visualize and track that work. But it can also be used in tandem with a Gantt chart for something that is a waterfall project or maybe more of a hybrid methodology. I see there are some questions in the chat about Trello and charges. There are a couple different versions. There's a free version, and that's honestly what I use for most of my projects. It does have a little bit limited capabilities, but you can still do a lot of cool things with it. Like creating these boards, adding people to it, uploading Google Docs or other documents if that's how you're documenting the work. So there's a lot of really cool features with the free version, but there are a lot of really nice premium features if you do go with a business license for that. And I'm not sure if that's going to be talked about in the software and tools conversation coming up, but yeah, can't recommend Trello enough for managing work in a really dynamic and visual way. Okay, so the next element, moving away from work breakdown structure that I want to talk about is stakeholder management. So stakeholders will have different levels of influence and interest in the project. And the tool that I like to use is called a RACIC matrix that helps you clarify who's accountable for what and who needs to be informed when. So the elements of the RACIC matrix, and it's an identification tool, are responsible, approve, supports, inform, consult. So responsible parties ensure that the project or task is completed on time and within budget. And that often falls to the project lead, but it could be if there's a project lead and co-chair, it might be a small group or a small team. Approve, this person approves a deliverable before it is official. So this might be the sponsor of the project, or it might be a committee who is deciding how and when things can move forward. Supports is the group or individual who executes the task. So this is often the project team, but it might be other resources that you pull in to complete an element of the project. The next one is inform. So this group receives information on status, content, or approval. So they might not necessarily have a say in when things move forward or when things are approved, but they are groups that you want to keep informed throughout the process, depending on what their role is. And then consult. This group is an additional resource for support and information. So these might be subject matter experts who can weigh in and provide information on elements of the project. It could be someone in an HR role, it could be someone with a legal background, but they are not actually doing the work, they are consulting and providing expertise. So know that when you're putting together your stakeholder management plan, you're not necessarily going to include all stakeholders because that could be really broad and really big. Could be a really big spreadsheet. So you might think, end users or patrons might not have a lot of influence or interest in the project. So an example would be, say your project is to update the internal process, an internal process that you're changing that you hope will improve the service to your end users, to your customers, to your patrons. You might be tempted to list them in the stakeholder management plan and keep them informed in that informed group. But it's probably unlikely that they're going to be interested in the fine details or have much influence. So in that situation, you might choose to add them to the communication plan instead and determine what information you want to push out to them when, if at all. So maybe there's going to be some changes that will impact their ability to access a specific space or tool for a short period of time. That might be when you decide to inform them, but that wouldn't necessarily need to go into your stakeholder management plan. All right. Excuse me. So the last bit that I want to talk about is the risk management plan. So, excuse me. A risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on the project's objective. So every project has risks that could impact the success of the project. And a risk management plan doesn't imply that these certain conditions won't happen, but you'll be better prepared to address them when they come up. So to put together your risk management plan, start by identifying the risks to your project. These can be resource risks like running out of budget or running out of people to do the work. They could be related to quality issues. So have you gathered the necessary requirements to ensure that your deliverable is going to be approved, is going to meet the needs of the end user or customer or sponsor? It could also be organizational or political risk. If stakeholders don't feel like they're being heard or updated enough, they might be resistant, or there might be other kind of factors playing in at the kind of higher level of the organization that could impact the success of the project. And yes, risks aren't necessarily negative. You could have positive risks, but they're just things that are uncertainties. So a positive risk might be you implement a new program that's so exciting that 3 other libraries want in on the action. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it might require a change in scope or in timeline or budget to meet that new request. So once you've identified your risks, you want to identify the probability or likelihood that they will occur. And you can see on here, it's an example of how you might track that. You can use a number scale like 1 to 5, or you can use a naming convention like low, medium, high. Similarly, you'll want to identify the potential impacts to the success of your project. So you can use the same number scale, 1 through 5, or low, medium, high impact. And then you'll talk about the actions or mitigation strategies. So these might be ways to navigate if a risk comes to fruition, or if you have something that is both high probability and high impact, you maybe want to identify a proactive strategy to minimize the likelihood that the risk derails your project. So an example, and it might be a little bit hard to see, so I apologize for that, but a risk could be running out of funding. So there could be a low probability, but a high impact to your project if that were to occur. So in that case, you might choose to meet with the sponsor regularly and give regular updates on the project budget. So, and then you'll want to document who's the owner of that responsibility. So does that fall to the project manager? Is there someone else on the team that needs to be responsible for that? But basically in doing this, it allows you to think through potential impacts to the project and help keep you on track. And in that template that you'll be receiving, there is a tab for risk management that basically is where I pulled this from. All right. So the last topic is around getting input and vetting the plan. And before we get there, Carla, are there any major questions that have come up in the chat?
Not really. We've kind of been taking care of those as we go along. Okay. Someone was asking about integration in some of the tools, but I think that Sarah is going to cover more of that in the software tools session.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
I will say, excuse me, so I sit right underneath the vent, and when it kicks on, my allergies just go crazy, so bear with me. I've got my water next to me. From that standpoint of integration, I think as you're doing the project planning phase, thinking about how you can condense all of the documentation into one area is really key. So the thing that I like about the template that I'm sharing is that it's multiple tabs on a spreadsheet, so you can hop around to each, you can add to it, so that all of the information is basically in one place, and it all kind of ties together, and you can see where it ties together. I think that's a really valuable approach. And then, yeah, using Trello, if you can upload your project documentation right to your Trello board so that it's easy to access, I think that's a really great way to make it easy to access, but also just incorporate that transparency for everyone who has access to that documentation. Okay. So the last topic that I want to talk about is getting input and vetting the plan. So you as a project manager, project lead, could spend a lot of time putting together all the elements of the project plan. You can make it look really elaborate and neat, but if you don't get buy-in from people who are going to be supporting the project, either by being on the team, working on the project, or being a sponsor and advocating for the project, your plan's not really going anywhere. So I've identified some do's and don'ts when getting input and vetting the plan. So the first, let's start with the don'ts. Let's start with the watch-outs. And the first is try to create the project plan by yourself. And I will say that I've done this and it never works because you're just one person with one perspective and you're going to have blind spots. So it can be really easy, I think, to fall into that trap, especially if you're someone who likes to kind of work on your own and think and process on your own. But I think that the best way to go about it is to get a lot of input from a lot of different people. Don't rush through this phase. So as someone mentioned earlier, you need to plan to improve the timeline. And this is, I think, just so key. Because as you're doing the planning, it can be really tempting, I think, to just start doing the work because you're excited, you've got that energy, you're starting to see how it's going to come together, and you might have a condensed timeline. But if you rush through the planning phase, you're going to end up having to go back and rework things because you weren't quite sure where you were going. And then definitely don't wait until you have a full plan to communicate with your stakeholders. Again, getting their input throughout the process is really key. So the tips, Get input from your team, sponsor, key stakeholders, and customers. Really flesh out what are the needs, what are the requirements, what is going to make the project successful, what are the things to be aware of, to watch out for. They'll have a lot of really great input. And when you get that input, spend the time reworking the plan based on the input that you've received. So this might be a little bit iterative. You might start out with a project plan, shop it around, get some feedback, and then have to go back and change. And that's okay. That's a part of the process. It's going to make your project plan stronger. And then talk about the plan as you're putting it together and ask for feedback. I think that it can be easy to fall in the trap of this isn't done yet, so I don't want to share it. But really sharing things out, even in their draft form, even if they're sort of in their nascent state, is totally okay. And it's going to allow you to gather ideas, again, to gather that input and to put something together that's going to be really powerful, really, really workable, and that people can buy into because they've been brought along throughout the process. So one key way to do this is through your project team kickoffs. And I just put together a sample agenda, and this is probably going to be a couple sets of meetings. So you might look at the project planning as a specific phase of the project itself, and spend some time with your team, bringing in stakeholders, bringing in your sponsor to talk through these items. And the first one is an icebreaker activity. This is going to be, really key if you've got a lot of people from different organizations or different areas of your organization who don't know each other, don't work with each other. It just helps break the ice, get people talking, kind of build that camaraderie. The next, review your charter and scope and make sure that everyone is on board and in agreement about what you're doing and what the scope is. Again, thinking back, you want to avoid that scope creep. And this is a good way to do it by making sure that everyone is clear, everyone has the same understanding of what the project is. Then you'll want to review that schedule and milestones and maybe talk through it. See if there's anything that you're missing, see if there's anything that needs to be added or doesn't make sense. Again, a lot of this is just really level setting and making sure that everyone is on board and that you're getting as much good input as you can. And then talk through the stakeholders using a power and interest grid. I really like this tool. It's just a kind of a 4-box tool to help you identify who are going to be the key stakeholders that you really need to think about managing. So who's going to be put into that stakeholder management plan? So you'll see here you have your power, high, low, your interest, high, low, and then you have different kind of ways to manage. So understand and keep satisfied for those who have high power, but maybe a little bit lower interest in the project. You want to manage closely and create strategies to engage those who have really high power and really high interest in the project. For those who are on the low side, you'll want to monitor and inform occasionally. And then those that have really high interest, but maybe low power or influence, you want to consider and keep informed. So this is a really great tool to get a lot of information to help you create that robust stakeholder management plan. And then you'll want to talk through risk identification. And this can just be a matter of putting Post-its up, or if we're still virtual, doing virtual Post-its via Jamboard or something like that. But just get all the ideas out there and start a conversation around what are the potential risks, what are the impacts, and how to manage those. And then you'll want to talk about the team norms and decision making. And this is going to be all about how are decisions going to be made in the team and who's making them? Are you going to be focusing on consensus? Is it going to be up to the project manager? When will it be up to the project manager? And then other team norms around communication. What tools are you going to use to keep each other informed? Are you going to use tools like Slack? Is it going to be primarily through email? Are you going to use Google Chat? How often are you meeting? And how much work needs to be done outside of the meeting? Is the expectation that the meeting is just for sharing updates? Or are the meetings going to be more working meetings? So really getting everyone on board with how the team is going to work together. And the next time, the next webinar is all about project leadership, and I'll be diving a little bit deeper into team formation, strategies for influencing and pushing the team forward, giving feedback, things like that. And then finally, talk about project documentation. What is the documentation plan? Where are the documents going to live? Who has access? Things like that. So,
Ashley, Janice has a question. Can you explain this board again? It's confusing.
the power and interest grid? Yes.
I think so.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So basically, if you think about the activity, you've got your team together. Talk about who are all of the stakeholders that you're going to be that are going to be impacted or involved in the project. It could be leadership teams. It could be different user groups. It could be different departments. And you generate the list, and then you identify who has the power to kind of make or break the project. So who could potentially advocate for and uplift the project? Who could potentially derail it? And then on the interest side, it's who is going to be basically most interested in the project outcome, who is going to be a potential would be impacted by the project outcome. And then from there, you'll kind of talk through where people fit, and then that leads to how to manage them effectively. So for example, if you have someone that is in that they're high power, they have the ability to kind of uplift and really make the project take off, or they have the ability to kind of stop things, not approve deliverables, and they're really interested. They're going to be kind of they could potentially be a champion for the project. You'll want to think about how you're going to engage them throughout. It might be getting more routine feedback. It might be having regular check-in meetings with them, versus someone who maybe falls into that low category. So they don't have a lot of power over whether or not the project succeeds or fails. They don't have a lot of interest. Maybe they'd be kind of tangentially interested, but they don't want to know all of the minutia of the project. It could be, again, it could be a patron. So if you think about a project that would be updating an internal process in hopes that it's going to make the experience for the patron a little bit better, you might not really communicate with them a lot. You might communicate with them, inform them occasionally. You might let them know, hey, we did this thing at the end of the project, and here's how it's going to impact you. But it wouldn't be something where you'd be communicating out regularly with them. Does that help? Does that make sense for how you might use that board? Great. And that opens us up next to what are your questions? So is there anything that you want to talk through more? Anything that I didn't cover in enough detail? And I'm always happy to share my pitfalls or lessons learned too, if those are helpful. All right. Could you share the board template with us? Yes. And it is going to be on the slides that you'll receive. Is there one biggest mistake that people make? Well, I can tell you one of the biggest mistakes that I make. I can't speak for everyone, but I can tell you that I have multiple times done the work of trying to plan a project on my own and then unveiled it and been told that won't work. Or that's an unrealistic timeline, or that doesn't make sense. So I think one of the biggest mistakes, one of the biggest lessons that I've had to learn is that you really do need to bring people along in this phase. specifically. It's not just about once you hit the ground running with actually doing the work, but when you're planning, when you're starting to put together that work breakdown structure, getting input and sharing out what you're thinking is really, really valuable.
I think the next question after that was from Lisa, and she asked, are there templates for team norms and decision making?
There are some good templates, especially for decision making. And at the next one, I'll do a plug for the February 26th webinar. I'll be talking a little bit more about that. So team norms, team formation, and decision making, so that you can set the team up right with the same expectations, clear expectations about how to work together, how you'll be giving feedback. So yeah, stay tuned. Right. Any general guidelines on who should work on creating the project plan? Team members, sponsors, others. So I would say start with the sponsor as far as getting the getting kind of the recommendations or the requirements, and ask about who are those key stakeholders who might have a lot of power and influence over the project, and maybe hear from them. But really in actual planning, I say engage the team members. They're going to have a lot of really great insight. They might have some really good experience on similar projects that they can say, oh yeah, I remember trying that, and here were some of the pitfalls with doing it that way. So engaging the team members also really helpful for getting them on board and excited about the plan. So if they can start seeing what their role is in that project, I think that helps to really create a lot of energy and engagement at the start. And then others you might bring in, again, there might be some subject matter experts that you want to consult with at this point, but I say the team members and the sponsor are really key. All right. Corey asks, how do you begin to wrap your mind around the workflow of tasks? Do you start from the beginning or start from the desired result and work backwards? I really like the approach of starting from the desired result and working backwards. I think that is a good way to approach most problems, and really helpful, especially if it's something where maybe you don't have the previous experience working with. So that would be my suggestion. And if you're running into any kind of challenges throughout the process, so even if you started trying to do sequentially, start part 2, part 3, if you run into any issues, start by working backwards and seeing what you missed. Comment, our director often advises people that the worst plan is having no plan at all. Yeah. And like I mentioned before, oftentimes, and in my experience, when I haven't had a plan or it hasn't been clearly articulated, that's when you get halfway through and you're like, oh, this isn't going to work the way that I thought. And now I need to go back and rework. It ends up adding time to your timeline. It can push you over to being kind of past due, not meeting your time requirements, or not meeting your budget requirements. So yes, wholeheartedly agree. Have a plan. How do you best anticipate how long things will take? I don't know how to do this really well, and I would say I don't do this well, and that's why I ask for input. So consulting with people who may have had experience with a specific task or phase ahead of time, getting their input on, okay, I know that you've done something similar to this. How long did it take you? Is really, really valuable, because oftentimes I know I and others underestimate how long something will take, especially if you've got people who are working on multiple projects or competing priorities, or things that are just unforeseen that can forestall things. Yeah, so I recommend asking for input on this all the time. Question on getting feedback and input on project plans. Is sharing a draft useful, or are there other approaches to getting group and team involvement to drafting a project plan? So yeah, I think that I think it kind of depends on your audience. So for example, with the project team, you might show them a draft and get their input and do some conversations around that. But if you're thinking about talking to, say, a leadership team, you might want to have something that's a little bit more dressed up. Maybe it's in a slideshow that that kind of explains more at a high level what you're thinking and getting their input that way. So I think really think through who's the audience and who's going to be maybe looking at it more often. But I think the project team, giving them visibility early is a really good approach. Next question. Do you recommend having consistent project plan templates among a team? Or should it be whichever format works for the project lead? Yeah, this is a really good question, and I think something that I've grappled with. I like consistency. I like having things uniform. So my style would be to have things be really consistent. But I would say also giving room for flexibility is important. So that's why I like having a template to work from that has all of the elements, but adjusting it to kind of suit the needs of the project. So for example, for the Gantt chart that I shared, that's kind of a work in progress. That's one where there aren't a lot of team members. There are more people who are consulting on it. So I changed it up rather than having the RASIC matrix in that spreadsheet. I pulled it out, had it separate, and adjusted to have status because I felt that was an important piece for tracking the work of that project. So I would say if you have kind of a consistent place to start from, I think what's more important is having consistent language and understanding of the best practices and methodologies so that everyone at least knows the elements and then can make informed decisions on how to adjust things from there. Really good question. Does the structure change much if you are a single person team? So yes and no. So for example, that performance management upgrade, I'm kind of the one currently leading and doing the work for that and having different groups that I consult with. So it did change a little bit, the fact that there were some elements on the Gantt chart that I showed that I eliminated because they weren't going to be helpful. But the process of actually going through and planning the project was very similar. I still got input from the people that I'm consulting with. I still got input from some of the end users and really communicating closely with my sponsor to make sure that I'm on track. Let's see. When mapping out a large project, when is it better to break it into smaller projects or decrease the scope? Yeah, good question. I would say that that's another one where you might want to get input. So so an example might be, oh, here's a perfect example. So we, like I mentioned, are doing strategic planning. And during our input gathering phase, we had multiple things that we decided we wanted to do. We wanted to have a survey for students and faculty and staff at the libraries or at the university. We wanted to have staff input from library staff. We wanted to have focus groups and do an environmental scan. And we realized that we wouldn't be able to do that all in the timeline that we identified as a large group. So we did end up kind of breaking it into smaller projects and had kind of smaller subgroups to be able to address those things and do those things concurrently. So we had a survey team working on the survey at the same time that there was a focus group team working on the focus group. And I'd say that that was an instance when I talked to the team and asked, okay, how can we approach this and get it done when we've only got 4 months to do it? And we're going to be really ambitious in the input that we want to get. And through that conversation came the idea of let's split up, let's do these things concurrently and not stack them. And that it ended up being really successful. We were able to meet our deadline. So I think having those conversations and getting the input from the team to try and tackle those issues is key. All right. We've got a lot of good questions. I love it. Let's see. Are projects sometimes quickly defined for a grant deadline? If yes, what is the impact on the project? I have to be honest and say that I haven't worked a lot with grants, but I would invite Carla or Francine. Do you have any insight on this question? I think it's a good one.
Are projects sometimes quickly defined by grant deadline? Sometimes they can be. Yeah, that's a tough one. You don't want to rush the formation of that project. But if you are dealing with a deadline for a grant, I think the key piece would be to identify those milestones, have your project charter and scope clearly defined so that will help you write out your grant. I think does that help?
I agree. You're defined by your deadline in that situation, so you just need to make it work out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that approach of really identifying what are the milestones and kind of from a high level, what is that project plan? And then you might have to on the fly do a little bit more of an iterative approach to actually creating and fleshing out that project plan. Good question. Another one. So when you conclude a project, what steps do you take to conclude it? Celebrate or others? Yes, celebrate. Recognize the team, recognize the success. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too in project leadership, because I think it's so key for that project manager, for the project leader to recognize success throughout. So it might be when you reach a milestone, for example, you have some sort of recognition, reflection, calling out all of the great work of the team. I think that's a really key piece. As far as concluding it from like a documentation standpoint, often ending with a lessons learned, a retrospective is really, really valuable, because that's when you can talk about, okay, we thought that this piece was going to take this long and it ended up taking way longer than we expected. So you can talk through and document that, and that helps future similar projects who might have that element come into play. I think that lessons learned is a really valuable thing, and it's often, I think in my experience, not done, because once you get to the end of the project, you're just so excited that it's done that you kind of celebrate and then move on to the next thing. So taking that time, talking about lessons learned, talking about what worked well, what didn't, what you do differently, and documenting that is really key. I feel like I'm saying is really key a lot, but there are a lot of really key things about project planning and running projects. Another question. I run into a lot of delays when explaining technology issues and tools to administrators and supervisors. The project stagnates because it is dependent on their decision to give permission. Approaches to help with this. Yeah, and I can address that a little bit more too in the project leadership, because there's a lot of influence that needs to be done. But to start, think about the audience and what is going to be most meaningful and important to them. So, for example, an administrator might not need to know all of the nitty-gritty details of how a tool works, They just need to know what is the impact going to be on whoever's going to be using the tool. So for example, if you're implementing a new technology or tool that is internally focused, it's going to help automate a process. Talking about what the impact of that automation on the efficiency is going to probably be much more their speed than talking about all of the different kind of functionalities and elements of it. And when you're thinking about technology issues, same thing applies. Talking about what is the impact and what does it mean for either the staff or the end user or the patrons is going to be probably much more what they're concerned with. Great question there. All right. Other questions? Carla, are you seeing we probably have time for one or two more?
Yeah, I was just gonna say we've got about 2-3 minutes left. I do see a question from Stacy at the start. You said you highly recommend a program or class you took in project management. I missed what it was.
Yes, it's a project management certificate through the College of Continuing and Professional Studies at the University of Minnesota. And I think right now they might be doing some online classes. Typically they're held in person, but right now we're not able to meet in person. So I think they're running them online. So if you aren't local to the Twin Cities, this would be a great time to check it out.
And I'd like to reiterate that having a certificate in project management is not necessarily necessary for your work in libraries. But it's really, really, really helpful to have an understanding of the process of project management and how it can apply to the work that you do.
100%. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Carla, because there's so many practical applications. And one of the things that I do love about the program that we were referencing through the University of Minnesota is that it does kind of talk about project management in that practical way. But these are tools that anybody can really adopt and tweak to fit their own circumstance. And I know that so many of us are running projects because that's how a lot of work gets done. That's how a lot of new things come about is through projects and that collaborative effort or that planned effort to do something new. So I think it's something it's a skill that is just growing in need, and something that if you can, learn through LinkedIn Learning webinars or webinars like this, or even going on YouTube, there's a lot of benefit to being able to learn some of these concepts.
And we are at 2:00. So thank you, Ashley. This was a very informative, great presentation. Ashley will be presenting the next session in our series on project leadership, which will be in 2 weeks at the same time. If you're not registered for that, please go ahead and register for that one. And if you have any further questions between now and then, feel free to email me. You have my contact information, Carla Fahl, PFAHL001 @umn.edu. And I will be happy to pass that any questions along to Ashley or Francine as we move forward. So thank you all for joining me today. Thank you, Ashley, again.
Thank you.
I will end today's recording, and everyone have a great weekend.